You know, it seems like these days, keeping your cloud environment secure, it's less like, I don't know, a carefully planned operation and more like, trying to walk through a minefield while you're blindfolded. I mean, there's just so many ways things could go wrong, right? Like every day, it seems like there's some new vulnerability popping up.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty accurate way to put it. You're absolutely right. The digital landscape is constantly shifting, and unfortunately, so are the tactics of the people trying to exploit it. And, security teams are constantly facing this really tough challenge. How do you pick out those really important signals from all the noise?
That's a great point, and it's actually exactly what we're diving into today. So, we've been taking a deep dive into this super interesting article from Security Boulevard, and it really nicely lays out two pretty different and really fascinating modern approaches to cloud security. So, we're talking about Wiz with their Security GraphDB and then DeepTempo with their LogLM technology.
Yeah, it's such a great comparison, right? I mean, both of these companies, they're trying to do the same thing. They want to make the cloud more secure, but the way they go about it is like fundamentally different.
Exact.
So our goal in this deep dive is to really unpack these technologies, show you how they work, what they're good at, and then maybe think about how you could even use them together to get even better protection.
Right. It's about clarity, not complexity.
Exactly.
So, the main thing we're looking at today is this Security Boulevard article. It's called Wiz's Security GraphDB versus Deep Tempo's LogLM. So if you find this interesting and you want to go a little deeper, that's the place to start. But okay, let's jump in.
Let's do it.
So we got to start with Wiz and their big innovation, which is the security graph, right? So what is it about their approach that's so different?
Well, I think Wiz kind of shook things up when they came out with this
Yeah.
idea. It's an agentless, graph-based way of understanding risk in the cloud. So instead of doing what everybody else was doing, installing agents on all your servers and devices, Wiz just uses the APIs that cloud providers already have to get a complete picture of your entire cloud setup,
Got it.
all in one place.
Okay, so at the center of this whole unified view is this thing called the security graph. So is it more than just some, I don't know, fancy dashboard? What's going on behind the scenes?
Oh, it's way more than just a dashboard.
Mhm.
The security graph is like a super detailed map, right? A knowledge graph or a graph database,
Yeah.
and it keeps track of all your cloud resources. We're talking about virtual machines, containers, databases, serverless functions.
Oh, wow.
But it doesn't stop there,
Right.
right? It also maps their configurations, any vulnerabilities that are known, the identities that have access, and this is the important part, all the relationships between these things. It's basically like they built a living, breathing blueprint, a digital twin of your whole cloud environment, and it's even updating in real time as things happen.
So it's like having this complete and constantly updated picture of your cloud.
Exactly.
Wow, okay. And that's so important because, the article makes this really good point. Like, a lot of these traditional security tools, they kind of operate in isolation. It's like they're telling you, hey, your blood pressure is high, but they don't know if you also have, like, a heart condition,
Oh,
right? They're just looking at these individual vulnerabilities.
yeah, that's a great analogy. And it's true, a lot of these older tools, they don't talk to each other. They're stuck in their silos. But Wiz's graph approach breaks down those silos by showing you your cloud as this big web of nodes and connections. So you can trace how a vulnerability in one spot, maybe it seems small on its own, could actually turn into a serious security hole when you consider how it's connected to everything else.
Okay, that makes sense. And Wiz has this really clear way of explaining it. They say a security graph makes the complex simple by surfacing the relationships between cloud components as first-class citizens. It's not just a visualization layer, but the database, the normalizing data model, and the analysis layer.
Right. So it's not just showing you the connections, it's understanding and analyzing them too.
That's huge. Okay, so this deep understanding of how everything's connected is like essential for identifying what they call toxic combinations. And I'm curious, could you give us an example of what a toxic combination might look like in the real world?
Sure, absolutely. The article has a really good example. So
Hmm.
imagine you have this database. It's full of sensitive customer data, right?
Yeah.
Now, maybe the database itself is encrypted. It seems secure on its own. But let's say this database can be accessed from a virtual machine, and maybe for some reason, like an operational reason, that VM is directly exposed to the public internet.
Mm.
And to make matters worse, that same VM, the one that's exposed, it has a critical vulnerability that can be exploited.
Oh, no.
So individually, maybe none of these things seem like a huge deal, right? I mean, a
Uh-huh.
public VM isn't automatically bad. Databases need to be accessible. And unfortunately, vulnerabilities are kind of just a fact of life these days.
Yeah, but together, that's a scary combination.
Exactly. When the security graph maps all those relationships, the sensitive data in the database, the fact that it can be accessed from the internet through that VM, and
Yeah.
the critical vulnerability on that VM, well, suddenly it's really obvious that there's a big problem.
Right.
I mean, an attacker could use that exposed VM, get into the database, and then steal or mess with all that sensitive customer data.
Right.
So that's the power of seeing and understanding those interconnected risks.
So it's not just about individual vulnerabilities, it's about the bigger picture. Okay, so with all these vulnerabilities being discovered all the time, I mean, tens of thousands every year, how does Wiz help security teams figure out what to focus on first? What needs to be fixed immediately?
Well, that's where their idea of ruthless prioritization based on context comes in. They don't just throw a massive list of every CVE at you.
Hmm.
Instead, they use the security graph to figure out which vulnerabilities are the riskiest for your specific cloud environment. And they look at a few key things when they're prioritizing.
Okay, let's break down those factors. So the first one they mention is public exposure. I mean, that seems pretty straightforward, right?
Yeah, it's pretty simple. If something's directly accessible from the internet, it's way easier for an attacker to target. Wiz says it like this: a vulnerable VM with access to the internet poses a greater risk since it can be more easily exploited by malicious actors. And their security graph is really good at finding these exposed assets and figuring out which vulnerabilities make them even riskier.
Okay, so exposure is key. The second factor is high privileges or sensitive access. And again, that makes sense, right? The more access something has, the more damage it can cause if it's compromised.
Exactly. A vulnerability on something with admin privileges or access to really sensitive data is a much bigger deal. Like Wiz points out, a vulnerable VM that can assume an admin INM role or contains an API key with admin privileges is at much higher risk. If an attacker gets into something like that, the damage could be widespread. And the graph helps connect vulnerabilities to those identities and access controls.
Okay, so it's not just about what's vulnerable, but who or what has access to it. And the third thing they look at is known exploits and threat intelligence, which includes things like CISA's known exploited vulnerabilities catalog or the KEV catalog, right?
Right. If a vulnerability is already being used by attackers out there in the wild, or if it's on a list like CISA's KV, then obviously you need to fix it ASAP.
Yeah.
Wiz uses these real-time threat intelligence feeds to make sure you're aware of the most urgent threats. But it's interesting. Wiz actually found that less than 1% of the vulnerabilities they find are actually on the CISA KV catalog.
Oh, wow, that's surprising.
Yeah, it makes you think, right? Maybe relying only on these curated lists isn't enough to give you a complete picture of what's really going on out there.
You might be missing a lot of stuff that's actively being exploited.
Exactly.
Okay, so the last key factor that Wiz considers is asset criticality and business impact. That seems really practical, right?
Yeah, it's about understanding what would actually happen to your business if this specific vulnerability got exploited. Would you lose a ton of data? Would your systems go down for a long time? Would you lose a lot of money? Wiz emphasizes focusing on resources that pose a real risk, such as resources effectively exposed with high permissions or access to critical data.
So if a system has really important data or is crucial for your business to function, a vulnerability on that system is automatically a much bigger priority.
Precisely. So by looking at all of these things together, the exposure, the privileges, the known exploits, and the potential impact on the business, Wiz can help security teams cut through all the noise and focus on those toxic combinations that are the biggest threats to the organization.
So it's about moving from a reactive approach, just chasing alerts all the time, to a more proactive strategy of shutting down those dangerous pathways that attackers could use. And the article then brings up this really interesting contrast with DeepTempo in their approach, which uses these things called LogLMs. That stands for large language models built on log data. And that sounds like a very different way of thinking about cloud security.
It's definitely a big shift. So Wiz is all about mapping out and fixing the known risks, the stuff that's already out there. But DeepTempo is tackling those more sneaky, unknown attacks, the attacks that might not use known vulnerabilities or misconfigurations. The article calls it a friendly Eye of Sauron view of your cloud activity.
That's a great image. So instead of focusing on the relationships between known things like Wiz does with its graph, DeepTempo is learning from all that log data your systems generate. looking for anomalies that might be signs of something bad happening.
Yeah, that's the basic idea. They want to help you see, respond to, and recover from attacks with far better precision. And they do that by looking for weird and unusual patterns in all those logs that modern cloud environments are constantly spitting out. And the article asks this really important question. Can a rules and relationships graph model keep up with novel AI-generated attack patterns?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, Wiz is great at finding and fixing known weaknesses, what the article calls low-hanging fruit. But the problem is, attackers only need to find one way in, right? And now with AI tools, they can discover all these new and unexpected attack paths, like maybe exploiting some weird logic flaw in an application, or planning these multi-step attacks that don't rely on traditional vulnerabilities at all.
Exactly. And there's this great example in the article. Imagine an attacker who gets their hands on some legitimate user credentials. Maybe they trick someone with a really good phishing email. Now, instead of just setting off alarms by trying to break in with brute force, they could use those credentials to slowly and quietly escalate their access. They could take a bunch of small steps over time that wouldn't normally trigger any alerts. And because it's not exploiting a known CVE or a typical misconfiguration, Wiz's graph might not even notice it.
That's scary. So Wiz is good at identifying those things we know could go wrong, the known unknowns, but it might not be able to catch those unknown unknowns, the stuff we don't even know to look for. And that's where AI-powered attackers could really take advantage.
Right. And that's exactly where DeepTempo's LogLMs come in. They're designed to catch those subtle anomalies and new behaviors that a traditional rules-based system would miss. They're not looking for specific signatures or known patterns of bad activity. Instead, they're constantly learning what normal behavior looks like based on all that log data.
Okay, so how do they do that? How do they learn what's normal?
So the article talks about DeepTempo's collective defense approach. Basically, their main LogLM is trained on anonymized data from tons of different organizations.
So they're using data from all over the place.
Exactly. And that lets the model learn about a much wider range of both normal and abnormal activity patterns than it could if it was just looking at data from one company.
That makes sense.
It's kind of like the model develops a community immune system. It's seen so many different behaviors and attack patterns that it can spot anything out of the ordinary.
Okay, so that's a big difference from Wiz, which is really focused on analyzing a single customer's environment. This collective learning approach from DeepTempo, that could make it way more adaptable to new threats, right?
Absolutely. And that adaptability is so important because, attack techniques are changing all the time. The article mentions that these foundation models can be fine-tuned much faster than traditional machine learning systems, so they can keep up with the latest threats and changes in the environment.
So they're constantly learning and adapting. Okay, and that brings us to those low and slow attacks that the article talks about. How can log LMs find those really subtle, drawn-out threats that might go unnoticed by other security tools?
So these are the attacks where each individual action might seem totally harmless, right? Maybe it's a bunch of logins from weird locations or a small increase in network traffic to some unknown IP address. But when you look at all these little things together over time, they start to form a suspicious pattern. And that pattern might be totally different from the normal behavior that the LogLM has learned. So these LogLMs, they're designed to go through tons of data and find those tiny deviations, even if no single event would set off any alarms.
And the article mentions that DeepTempo maps these anomalies to frameworks like Inary, ATT, and CK.
Yeah.
So that helps security teams understand what kind of attack might be happening. So to summarize, Wiz is giving you this clear, contextualized map of the known risks in your cloud, helping you figure out what to fix first. And DeepTempo is like that watchful eye of Sauron, constantly scanning your log data for anything unexpected, anything that doesn't fit the usual patterns.
Exactly.
And this leads to the big takeaway from the article. To really secure your cloud, you probably need both of these approaches.
I totally agree.
Yeah.
It's not about choosing one or the other. They work together to solve different but equally important security problems.
Right. Wiz helps you build a strong foundation by dealing with the risks you know about, making sure those critical vulnerabilities are patched and your configurations are secure. It's about minimizing the easy ways in for attackers.
And then DeepTempo comes in with that extra layer of protection, watching out for the unexpected stuff, the threats that might slip through the cracks.
Because no matter how hard you try, you can't eliminate every risk. Attackers are always finding new ways in. The article ends with this really thought-provoking statement. In an increasingly complex world where the adversary is learning faster than we are, The strategic combination of proactive risk prioritization focused on known vulnerabilities with adaptive threat detection capable of identifying novel attacks may very well be the key to keeping us all protected in the cloud.
That's a powerful way to put it.
So, to wrap up for our listeners, the key things to remember are Wiz's security graph is great at finding and prioritizing known risks by really understanding how everything in your cloud is connected and highlighting those dangerous, toxic combinations that need your attention right away. And DeepTempo's LogLMs offer this completely different but crucial ability to detect new and sneaky attack patterns by constantly learning what's normal in your environment and alerting you to anything unusual that might be a sign of a new or evolving threat.
Like a 1-2 punch.
Exactly. So we really encourage you to think about how these two approaches could work together to make your own cloud security strategy even stronger. One focuses on fixing the weaknesses you know about, and the other is always on the lookout for the surprises.
And this brings us to our final thought for you to consider. With all these new AI-powered attacks, how are we going to have to change our security strategies?
Right.
It's not just about patching known vulnerabilities anymore. What about continuous learning and anomaly detection? What about using AI to defend ourselves? These are some big questions we're all going to have to figure out as technology keeps changing so quickly.
It's a whole new world out there.
It is.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.